At the age of 63, Herschel Walker is still regarded as one of America's greatest sports icons, a name tied to achievements that very few athletes in history could ever come close to. He came from the poor rural area of Wrightsville, Georgia, but stepped onto the national stage with a near-perfect college career. In the Georgia Bulldogs uniform, Walker wasn't just an outstanding player, he was a phenomenon. Right in his first season in 1980, he played a major role in leading Georgia to the NCAA National Championship, becoming the centerpiece of one of the greatest feats in college football history. 2 years later, in 1982, Herschel Walker was awarded the Heisman Trophy, the most prestigious individual award in American college football, etching his name among the legends while still just in his early 20s. He was named All-American 3 times, consistently led the SEC in rushing yards, and left college as one of the greatest running backs the NCAA system has ever produced. When he moved to the professional level, Walker carried with him the reputation of a top-tier star. He played in the USFL before joining the NFL, becoming one of the rare players to rush for over 1,000 yards in a single season in both leagues. In the NFL, he wore the jerseys of the Minnesota Vikings, Dallas Cowboys, Philadelphia Eagles, and New York Giants, leaving his mark with over 8,000 rushing yards, more than 4,800 receiving yards, and a total of more than 13,000 all-purpose yards, a number that reflects rare durability and versatility. Walker was selected to the Pro Bowl twice, and the trade that sent him from the Vikings to the Cowboys in 1989 is considered one of the most pivotal deals in NFL history, indirectly laying the foundation for the Dallas Cowboys championship dynasty of the 1990s. To the American public, those accomplishments were enough to enshrine Herschel Walker in the pantheon of college sports glory and turn him into a symbol of strength, discipline, and unyielding will. But it is precisely where those brilliant honors end that the quiet tragedy of his life begins to emerge. Because every award, every record, every cheer came with an invisible expectation, Walker had to always be strong, always durable, always invincible. No one saw behind the numbers and trophies a man straining to hold it all together, a will forged not just through training but through the fear of being seen as weak. The achievements that lifted him to the top also built an invisible cage, where Herschel Walker was no longer allowed to be an ordinary man. He overcame poverty, overcame physical limits, overcame the toughest opponents on the field, but the price of glory was carrying the image of an icon who was not permitted to fall. And from there, Herschel Walker's story is no longer just a story of victories. It becomes a story of silent survival, of a legend built on dazzling achievements, but covering a pain that very few ever asked about. If you want to understand what really happened behind the titles and the spotlight of Herschel Walker, subscribe to the channel so we can continue into the next part of the story together. Herschel Walker's childhood did not begin with big dreams, nor with moments of being heard or sheltered. It began in poverty, in rural Georgia, where red dirt clung to shoes, where manual labor was the only way of life, and where a child's emotions were almost worthless. His family was large, cramped both in space and in attention. In a house where everyone had to strain just to survive, listening to a child talk about fear or sadness was seen as a luxury, not because his parents were cruel, but because they were exhausted too. That life had no room for gentle questions or comforting words, only discipline, endurance, and silence. From a very young age, Walker learned a bitter lesson: if you want to survive, don't bother others with your feelings. That loneliness grew even deeper when Walker carried a flaw he couldn't hide: severe stuttering. Every time he opened his mouth, words refused to obey, stumbling and breaking, making the boy feel isolated among his peers. In the harsh rural environment, where strength and quickness were valued above all, stuttering wasn't just a communication difficulty, it was a sign of weakness. Walker was mocked, belittled, seen as a slow child, even though inside he was anything but. Every snicker, every impatient glance carved another invisible wound. The boy gradually understood that the more he spoke, the more vulnerable he became, and so Walker began to speak less, then almost not at all. Silence wasn't a choice, it was the only shield he had. In that large family, Walker was not the center of attention. He was one of many children, and the rare attention usually went to practical things: who did what work, who fulfilled their duties how. Emotions weren't on the priority list. No one sat down to ask the stuttering boy how his day at school went, whether he was scared, whether he was sad. No one realized that the prolonged silence wasn't obedience, it was a stifled cry for help. Walker grew up feeling he had to handle everything himself, that if he broke, he had to break quietly, with no one to pick him up. That lack of protection left a lasting mark. When bullied, Walker didn't run home for comforting arms. When belittled, he had no one to vent his hurt to. All negative emotions were suppressed, bottled up, unnamed, unreleased. A child like that learns to survive by shrinking inward, by enduring, by telling himself the pain will pass if no one sees it. But the pain doesn't disappear, it just settles, waiting for another form to rise. It was in that context that Walker began turning to his body as a refuge. When words betrayed him, when emotions had no place, muscles, strength and endurance became the only language he trusted. Run faster, get stronger, train harder. That was how Walker proved his existence, without opening his mouth. There he didn't need to speak, he just needed to do. And in that small world, where sweat replaced words, Walker first felt he had value. But that value came with a harsh condition. He was only recognized when he was strong, when he didn't fall, when he showed no fragility. Herschel Walker's childhood, therefore, held no gentle memories. It was a long chain of forced silence, of learning to endure instead of being loved. That stuttering boy wasn't taught how to express emotions, wasn't taught that weakness is part of being human. Instead, he learned to lock everything inside. Each time he was hurt, that door closed a little tighter, and when that door shut completely, Walker no longer knew any other way to live except inside it. That prolonged silence built the foundation for the man Walker would become. A man who could endure crushing pressure without complaint, who could train to exhaustion without whining, but also a man who didn't know how to seek help when things spiraled beyond control. The child no one listened to grew into a man accustomed to not being heard, and worse, accustomed to not even hearing himself. The tragedy of Herschel Walker didn't begin on the field, didn't begin with the public events that came later. It began in that poor rural Georgia house, in the months and years he learned to be silent to survive, and in a boy who early on understood that if you want to make it, the best thing is to make sure no one knows you're hurting. The silence of childhood didn't vanish as Herschel Walker grew up, it just changed shape. From a boy swallowed by shame and contempt, Walker entered his teenage years with a deeply ingrained belief: pain only becomes dangerous when it's felt. And if you can't speak it, can't be heard, then the only way to survive is to bury it under something stronger. For Walker, that something was discipline. Not discipline as a virtue, but discipline as a form of self-punishment. He trained unlike other kids. When others stopped from fatigue, Walker kept going. When his body signaled pain, he saw it as proof he still controlled something. Suffering in that way was legitimized. It no longer weakened him. It became what kept him standing, because at least it was pain he created himself. Walker trained with an intensity that amazed and unnerved those around him. Hundreds of push-ups, thousands of sit-ups, running until his lungs burned and his legs went numb. But the goal was never just strength. Deep down, Walker wasn't training to be stronger than others. He was training to stop feeling anything. Each pounding heartbeat, each tensed muscle, each physical ache had a clear purpose to cover the emotions he didn't know how to name. When the body hurt, the mind went quiet for a while. When sweat poured, memories of shame, of days no one listened, were temporarily pushed back. In that world, Walker found a twisted kind of peace, where he didn't need to speak, didn't need to feel, just needed to keep going. Gradually, the body stopped being part of who Herschel Walker was. It became a tool, a machine that had to perform on demand, no breakdowns allowed, no resistance permitted. Walker learned to detach himself from pain, as if that body didn't belong to him. If it hurt, he pushed it further. If it tired, he forced it past the limit. There was no mercy for himself, because mercy was something he'd never been taught. In Walker's mind, weakness wasn't just dangerous, it was shameful. And so he set himself a brutal rule. The body exists to serve the will, not to be protected. It was during those years of self-punishment that a quiet dissociation began to form. Walker didn't notice it right away. He only knew that while training, he felt himself disappear. No more stuttering boy, no more poor kid looked down on, no more fear of abandonment. Just motion, breathing, and the endless repetition of effort. Those moments brought a strange sense of safety, as if he were retreating from the world to hide inside his own body. But that safety came at a cost. Each time Walker disappeared, another part of him learned to split off, learned to exist without the whole person being present. Extreme discipline didn't just shape Walker's body, it shaped the way he viewed life. Every problem was solved by tightening up more, trying harder, enduring more. There was no room for rest, because rest meant letting emotions rise to the surface. There was no room for softness, because softness was the door to memories he had locked away tight. Walker became a man who, even when no one demanded it, imposed impossible standards on himself. And when he fell short, he punished himself even more harshly. Those around him saw an ideal figure, iron discipline, extraordinary will, never complaining. But no one saw that this discipline was built on deep-seated fear. Fear of being looked down on like in the old days. Fear of being abandoned if he was no longer useful. Fear that if he stopped, everything he had buried would surge up and drown him. In Walker's world, sports were no longer about joy or passion. They were the final barrier between him and collapse. The seeds of dissociation didn't arrive as a shock. They crept in quietly, silently, through every extended training session, through every moment he forced his body to keep going, even as his mind had already left. Walker began living in a state of separation he wasn't aware of, one part working, fighting, enduring, the other part retreating, watching from a safe distance. This helped him survive in the short term, helped him get through days that if he had felt them fully, might have broken him. But in the long run, that separation planted the seeds for a deeper tragedy, where the person was no longer a unified whole. At this stage of his life, Herschel Walker was praised for his extraordinary discipline, for his ability to endure beyond normal limits. Few realized that what was called willpower was actually a survival strategy, formed from a child who had no one to protect him. Walker wasn't proud of his discipline, he needed it, because without it, he would have to face emotions he had never learned how to handle. And so, day after day, Walker continued to punish his body in the name of strength, while inside, his true self was quietly and silently fracturing, preparing for events he had no idea were waiting ahead. When Herschel Walker stepped into the University of Georgia, he didn't just join a prestigious football program, he stepped into a massive machine of national expectation. America at that time didn't see a young man who had just escaped a childhood of poverty and silence. They saw a promise, a perfect body, seemingly limitless strength, a story beautiful enough to carry the hopes of the entire South, and beyond that, a nation hungry for invincible symbols. Sanford Stadium became a cathedral, and Walker became the center of that faith. Every time he touched the ball, tens of thousands rose to their feet. Every run he made was given meaning far greater than himself, the honor of the school, the pride of the state, and the American dream retold through the language of muscle and victory. In that worship, there was no room for an ordinary human being, only room for an icon. Fame came too fast and too soon. When Walker won the Heisman Trophy, the most prestigious individual award in college football, that trophy wasn't just glory, it was a glittering chain. From that moment, he was no longer allowed to be tired, he was no longer allowed to doubt, he was no longer allowed to have an imperfect day. The Heisman didn't just recognize talent, it locked his image into an unbeatable mold. Every subsequent game was no longer a challenge, it was a mandatory test he had to pass. Every time he stepped on the field, Walker wasn't just playing for the team, he was playing for a legend being written even before he had time to figure out who he was. That pressure didn't come through threats, it came through cheers, it came in unconditional praise, in the expectant eyes of coaches, teammates, students, and even people who had never met him, but already believed he would never fail. In that world, fatigue was seen as weakness, and mistakes were seen as betrayal. Walker learned very quickly that recognition only existed as long as he kept winning. There was no pause to breathe, no space to wonder how much longer he could hold on. Every time his body ached, every time his mind sagged, he tightened his discipline even more, because stopping meant collapsing the image the entire nation had built. That worship quietly crushed his individual identity. Walker was no longer the boy from Wrightsville, no longer the stuttering child who felt ashamed every time he opened his mouth. All of that was erased from the official story. The media didn't talk about fear, they talked about strength. Fans didn't want to hear about fragility, they wanted to hear about records. And even Walker gradually came to believe that part of himself no longer had a place. He learned to stay silent when asked about feelings, learned to answer with stats, with yards, with wins. The stuttering boy didn't disappear because he was healed. He disappeared because he was buried under the armor of fame. At Georgia, Walker lived in a state of constant observation. Every step, every gesture was scrutinized. No one asked if he was scared, if he was tired, if he was lonely, because in their eyes, he wasn't allowed to have those emotions. He was the bearer of hope, and hope isn't allowed to tremble. Walker gradually lost the right to be an individual with normal limits. He no longer learned to listen to his body, he only learned to override it. He no longer learned to understand emotions, he only learned to ignore them. Everything inside him was compressed, pushed to the bottom, so the surface could always remain perfect. The tragedy of worship lies there. When an entire nation leans on a child, that child is no longer allowed to grow at a natural pace. Walker never had time to figure out who he was off the field. He was never allowed to try and fail like others. Failure, in his world, wasn't a lesson. It was a catastrophe. And so he learned to live in a state of perpetual tension, where all energy went into maintaining the image. That wasn't living. It was an endless performance. The more he was celebrated, the further Walker drifted from himself. The more he was praised as a hero, the more he had to hide his weakest parts. Sleepless nights, moments of anxiety before every game, nameless fears, all were treated as things that weren't allowed to exist. Walker didn't know that this very denial was leaving deep cracks inside. He only knew that if he kept running, kept winning, kept silent, everything would be okay. But everything wasn't okay. It was only postponed. At Georgia, Herschel Walker became a legend, but the price of that legend was the complete disappearance of the boy from before. The stuttering boy who once bowed his head in shame, who once longed to be heard, no longer appeared in any story told about him. In his place was an image polished until there was no room left for humanity. And it was in that moment, when the entire nation rose to applaud Walker, that a deeper tragedy was being sown. The tragedy of a person stripped of the right to be tired, the right to make mistakes, and the right to exist as himself. After Georgia, when Herschel Walker's name had spread far beyond the university campus and across America, fame was no longer a reward, it became the mandatory environment he lived in. Walker walked amid cheers that never stopped, amid admiring eyes, amid stories retold like legends. But the more he stood at the center of that praise, the more isolated he became. People loved Walker for the numbers, for the runs, for the sense of security he brought to the collective dream, not for the breathing, tired, trembling human inside the armor of achievements. In that world, love was conditional, and the condition was named victory. As long as Walker kept winning, he was loved. As long as he stayed strong, he was seen, and that cold truth turned fame into a narrow space, with no escape for his most fragile parts. Amid the roaring crowds, Walker learned to stand alone, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know what else to do. He had grown too accustomed to not being heard, too accustomed to his emotions not being a priority. Fame only reinforced the old lesson from childhood: don't bother anyone with your pain. Every time Walker felt exhausted, he reminded himself it was the price of greatness. Every time his body ached, he saw it as proof he was doing it right. No one saw the fatigue building day by day, because Walker never allowed it to show, and no one asked, because in their eyes, this man wasn't allowed to be tired. The danger of fame doesn't lie in the spotlight, it lies in the silence behind it. Walker had no space to talk about fear, fear of injury, fear of failure, fear that one day his body wouldn't meet what the whole world demanded. Those fears weren't considered legitimate, they were seen as signs of weakness, and Walker had spent his life running from those two words. So he swallowed them, buried them deeper, used discipline and training to fill every gap. Emotions, instead of being processed, were compressed another layer, deeper, heavier. In that way, fame became a prison decorated with applause. Outside was admiration, inside were invisible walls. Walker couldn't step out of his role, he couldn't say he was tired, because tiredness would crack the invincible image. He couldn't say he was afraid, because fear didn't fit the hero's story. And he couldn't stop, because stopping meant losing everything built around him. Success, which should have brought freedom, instead locked him in a brutal cycle. Keep being strong, or disappear. The more he was praised, the further Walker drifted from his own emotions. He began to see himself through the lens of performance, as if human value only existed on scoreboards and newspaper headlines. Rare private moments brought no relief, because even alone, Walker didn't know what to do with emotions buried for too long. He hadn't been taught how to rest, how to be weak, how to ask for help. Fame didn't give him those skills. It only demanded that he keep performing. In these years, the exhaustion didn't show itself through dramatic collapses. It was present quietly, in training sessions that stretched longer than necessary, in sleepless nights, in the feeling of emptiness, even in victory. Walker couldn't name that feeling. He only knew that every time the cheers faded, an uncomfortable void appeared, and to avoid facing that void, he turned back to what was most familiar: discipline, pain, and control over his body. Fame also changed how others saw him. Walker was no longer treated like a human being with limits, but like an asset to be exploited. Every time he stepped onto the field, he carried the expectations of thousands, and those expectations left no room for empathy. When he won, it was taken for granted. When he struggled, it was disappointment. In that logic, Walker was never allowed to just be himself. He had to be the best version, the strongest, the most durable, all the time. It was during this phase that Walker's loneliness reached a different level, not loneliness from a lack of people around him, but loneliness because no one truly saw him. People saw the body, saw the stats, saw the icon, but not the man slowly burning out inside. And Walker, accustomed since childhood to not being heard, didn't know how to demand it. He kept living according to the script that had been written for him, even as that script wore him down day by day. In Herschel Walker's story, fame was not the peak of happiness. It was a layer of concrete poured over old wounds, keeping them from healing while only pressing them down harder. Each new success was another lock, each round of applause a reminder that he wasn't allowed to fall. And so, amid the endless cheers, Walker kept walking alone, carrying unseen exhaustion, unasked fears, and emotions buried one layer deeper, waiting for the day they could no longer be suppressed. When he entered the NFL, Herschel Walker didn't step into just a sports league. He stepped into a system where violence was legalized and celebrated as an essential part of the game. There, the body was no longer a refuge for the human being, it was a resource to be mined. Everything Walker had learned in childhood and college, enduring, staying silent, pushing through, now became the mandatory condition for survival. No one asked him to stop. No one encouraged him to listen to his body. On the contrary, every signal of pain was interpreted as a sign of weakness, something with no place in a league where a person's value was measured by performance. The NFL welcomed Walker with enormous expectations. He wasn't seen as a rookie still learning. He was seen as a ready, sharpened weapon. Every time he took the field, his body was thrown into brutal collisions, unforgiving tackles, impacts no muscle was built to withstand forever. Injuries didn't come as sudden surprises, they came as a continuous chain, overlapping one another. Knee pain hadn't even healed before his back started rebelling. Muscles hadn't recovered from tightness before joints started screaming. But Walker didn't know how to stop. Stopping meant losing value. Stopping meant becoming replaceable. In this world, there was no concept of enough, only still usable, or not. Walker quickly understood that his body no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the schedule, to the playbook, to the organization's need to win. When he was healthy, he was praised. When he slowed down, he was questioned. Every time he stepped on the field, Walker carried not just physical pain, but an invisible fear that if this body betrayed him, everything he had built would collapse. And so he chose the most familiar path: ignore it. Pain gradually became a constant state, no longer a warning signal, but the background noise of life. Walker learned to live with it like someone living next to a never-ending ringing in the ears. Some pains he no longer felt clearly, not because they vanished, but because his mind had learned to detach. He stepped onto the field in what many called peak focus, but in reality it was emotional absence. When his body collided, he didn't think. When he was pulled down, he didn't feel. He just kept going. And in that continuing, his true self retreated even further. The violence in the NFL didn't just come from the hits, it came from a rhythm of life that allowed no recovery. Every week was a new battle, every season a long-term erosion. Walker wasn't taught how to care for himself, he was taught how to override, not taught how to rest, he was taught how to endure. And in that environment, the extreme discipline he carried from childhood wasn't questioned. It was praised as the ideal quality. Walker became the model of durability, while inside, piece by piece, he was wearing away. Human value in the NFL was converted into yards, into points, into the ability to take hits. Walker understood that very clearly. He no longer saw himself as a whole person, but as a set of functions that had to perform on demand. When those functions worked well, he had a place. When they malfunctioned, he became fragile. And because he refused to accept that fragility, Walker forced himself to push through again and again, despite increasingly intense signals from his body. There were nights after games when Walker lay motionless, pain spreading through his entire body, but he wouldn't allow himself to call it suffering. He called it work. He called it the price to pay. And because he was used to mental pain not being acknowledged, he treated physical pain the same way. No one needed to know. No one needed to hear. As long as he could still stand, as long as he could still play, everything was fine. At least that's what he told himself. But the body isn't an infinite machine. Every injury left a mark. Every act of ignoring pushed the boundary further. Walker began living in a state of perpetual tension, where pain no longer shocked him, it just made him tougher. And that very toughness kept him from realizing he was losing the ability to feel, not just pain, but himself. He existed, functioned, completed tasks, but he wasn't truly present. The NFL, with all its glamour and brutality, didn't give Walker what he had never had: safety. It only amplified what had already existed. A child who learned to endure in silence now became a man enduring under the lights. A person who once used discipline to self-punish now lived in a system that encouraged that very self-punishment. And when fame combined with legalized violence, the result was an inescapable loop. In this phase, Herschel Walker was seen as a relentless warrior, an athlete who never tired. But behind that image was a man increasingly detached from his own body, increasingly treating pain as normal, and increasingly unable to stop. Pain was no longer something to avoid, it was something to endure to prove worth. And in that prolonged endurance, the foundation for deeper events in Walker's life continued to be laid, quietly, without a sound, waiting until it could no longer be hidden. After the years of being drained in the NFL, when Herschel Walker's body had grown accustomed to pain as a normal state, something else began to happen, more quietly, harder to grasp, but far more dangerous. Not a clear collapse, not a moment of breaking under the lights, but small cracks in his personality, silently spreading wider. Walker still took the field, still trained, still was seen as a durable warrior, but inside, the control he had always relied on began slipping from his grasp. There were reactions from himself that confused him, outbursts without clear logic, behaviors he couldn't explain afterward, sometimes couldn't even fully remember. At first, they were just strange moments. Walker noticed there were periods in the day when his memory became blurry, as if someone had erased a few frames from the movie of his life. He couldn't name the phenomenon. He only knew that there were things he had done, words he had said, but when he tried to recall them, everything felt fragmented. For someone who always controlled everything through discipline, that feeling of losing control was terrifying. But Walker was used to not asking questions. He kept pushing everything down, calling it fatigue, calling it pressure, calling it the price of the life he was living. The intense reactions began appearing more often. Sometimes Walker exploded in anger for no clear reason. Sometimes he overreacted to trivial situations, as if all the energy suppressed for years had suddenly found an outlet. Those around him didn't understand what was happening. They saw a strong man, yet behaving in ways that frightened them. Walker didn't understand either, and that very lack of understanding made him panic. He had spent his whole life controlling his body, controlling his behavior, and now something inside was slipping beyond his reach. His family became the first to bear the consequences of this silent crisis, not because they were weak, but because they were closest. The anger, the unpredictable behavior, the hurtful words appeared in the space that was supposed to be safe. Walker didn't intend to cause pain, but he also couldn't control himself. And the most frightening part was that after those moments, he didn't always remember clearly what he had done. His family looked at him with worry and fear, while he looked back at himself with a sense of strangeness. The man he saw in the mirror began to no longer resemble the person he believed he was. Walker's greatest fear didn't come from others' reactions. It came from the growing realization that he was no longer fully in charge of himself. For someone who grew up in poverty, survived through discipline, and was celebrated for absolute control, this was a direct blow to the core of his identity. Walker began to doubt his own mind. He asked himself, "What's happening inside me? Who am I when I don't remember, when I don't control, when I hurt the people I love most?" But instead of seeking help right away, Walker did what he had been used to doing since childhood: stay silent. He feared that if he spoke out, if he admitted he was losing control, everything he had built would collapse. The hero image would shatter, fame would turn its back, and that fear made him grip tighter, try to hide more. He trained more, worked more, as if busyness could patch up the gaps in his memory and personality. But the harder he tried, the clearer those gaps became. Walker began living in a state of constant tension, not just tension from external pressure, but from internal fear that one day he would do something irreversible, fear that he would completely lose control, fear that he would become a danger to the very people he loved most. That was a fear he couldn't share because it touched the most forbidden thing in his image: mental weakness. Walker would rather endure physical pain than face the possibility that his mind was cracking. The memory gaps, the intense reactions, the inexplicable behaviors kept appearing like warning signs. But Walker didn't see them as cries for help. He saw them as things to endure. And in that endurance, the silent crisis grew deeper. His personality, already fragmented from years of self-punishment through discipline, now began to break apart more visibly, not into easily recognizable pieces, but into voids, blind spots within himself. At this stage, Herschel Walker was no longer just fighting external pressure. He began fighting himself, and that was the most terrifying battle, because the enemy wasn't far away. It was right inside his mind. Walker was terrified of himself, yet he kept moving forward, because he didn't know any other way to survive. And while the world still saw a strong, resilient man, inside, a deeper tragedy was quietly taking shape, irreversible. The silent crisis from the previous part finally reached the deepest core of tragedy in Herschel Walker's life, where all efforts at silence, endurance, and self-control no longer worked. This was no longer a story about pressure, injuries, or uncontrolled anger. This was the moment Walker had to face a truth more horrifying than any hit on the football field. He was not a single person living in that body. The diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder did not come as a release. It came as a psychological sentence. It forced Walker to look back on his entire life under a completely different light, where the memory gaps, the inexplicable behaviors, the violent outbursts were no longer random. They were signs of a mind that had been split for a very long time. When doctors explained that his mind had created different parts to survive, Walker didn't feel relief. He felt panic. The idea that there were others coexisting inside his own body was beyond what he could bear. For someone who had lived his entire life based on discipline, control, and personal responsibility, this diagnosis wasn't just a mental health issue, it was a direct assault on his code of living. Walker didn't ask, "How do I heal?" The first question that burst out of him was, "Then who is responsible for the things I've done?" The fear wasn't in the name of the disorder, it was in its moral consequences. Walker began to realize that there were parts of his life where he wasn't truly present, not asleep, not distracted, but completely absent. Decisions were made, words were spoken, actions happened that he only learned about later, through others' accounts. That thought plunged him into a constant state of horror. If he wasn't always the one in control, how could he trust himself? How could he trust that tomorrow, when he woke up, the person living this life would still be him? For Walker, it wasn't just fear of losing control, it was fear of losing his very self. The dissociated personalities didn't appear as dramatic or easily identifiable figures. They didn't introduce themselves with names, didn't step into the light clearly. They existed quietly, taking turns handling roles that Walker's mind once needed to survive. One part endured physical pain, one part carried the anger, one part played the fearless role, one part hid emotions to survive in a world that didn't allow weakness, and the part Walker thought was himself was just one of them. Realizing this didn't feel like an explanation, it felt like being torn in two. The greatest conflict Walker faced wasn't just the pathology, it was the collision between the pathology and his personal ethics. He didn't want to use the diagnosis as an excuse. He didn't want to say that because he was ill, he wasn't responsible. But at the same time, he couldn't deny that some behaviors happened outside his conscious control. That inner tug-of-war created a unique kind of mental pain, fearing himself while feeling guilty for the fear. Walker began asking questions with no clear answers. Can I ask forgiveness for things I don't remember doing? Can I promise not to repeat things I'm not sure I can control? In this phase, Walker's greatest horror didn't come from the outside world. It came from the moments he was alone. When there was no training schedule, no work, no noise to drown things out, his mind became a terrifying space. Every thought carried doubt. Is this my thought, or someone else's? Every emotion was questioned. Even peace became suspicious, because he didn't know where it came from, or how long it would last. Walker lived in a state of constant vigilance toward his own mind, a state more exhausting than any physical workout he had ever endured. The fear of not being able to trust himself spread to every relationship. Walker began worrying not just for himself, but for those around him. If he couldn't be sure how he would react, how could he guarantee safety for others? That anxiety wasn't dramatic, it was a moral burden. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but he also couldn't promise it wouldn't happen. And that very uncertainty made him withdraw more, isolate himself more, try to control by staying away. Loneliness, which had been a companion since childhood, now became a choice to protect others. At the core of this tragedy was a painful paradox. The dissociated personalities were created to help Walker survive in a harsh world, but as he grew older, they became the source of his deepest fear. What once saved him now threatened to break him. Walker was no longer fighting visible opponents. He was fighting a complex psychological structure formed over years of trauma, pressure, and self-punishment. And no tactic, no workout, no discipline was enough to resolve it quickly. This was the phase when Herschel Walker truly touched the bottom of his mental pain for the first time, not because he was weaker than before, but because he was forced to look straight at the truth that his strength had been built on fragmentation. He could no longer pretend that just trying a little harder, training a little more, would make everything okay. For the first time in his life, Walker faced a battle where willpower alone wasn't enough to win immediately, and that was both terrifying and the opening of a new path, the path of acknowledgement, healing and learning to live with himself. But at this point in the story, that acknowledgement didn't bring peace, it only brought a raw realization. Herschel Walker was no longer certain who he was in any given moment of living, and there is no greater horror for a human being than being unable to trust oneself. After the truth about dissociative identity disorder was named, Herschel Walker's private life entered its most fragile phase, where everything once kept hidden by silence could no longer be covered. Marriage, which he had hoped would be the last place to find stability, instead became a space of fear. What had once happened quietly, now emerged more clearly: uncontrolled outbursts, violent reactions from places even he didn't understand, and a pervasive sense of unsafety enveloping those closest to him. This wasn't the tragedy of scandal, it was the tragedy of a family forced to choose survival in the shadow of the uncontrollable. Violence doesn't always take the form of visible wounds. It appears in threats that make listeners tremble, in eyes that no longer feel familiar, in the uncertainty of not knowing what the next moment will bring. Walker wasn't always aware of how dangerous those reactions were, and that very lack of awareness made the fear deeper. When people can't predict the behavior of the person next to them, home stops being a refuge. It becomes a space of perpetual tension, where silence isn't peace, it's vigilance. Faced with that reality, the family had no choice but to separate to survive. The decision to leave wasn't betrayal, it was self-protection. For loved ones, staying meant placing themselves in unpredictable danger. For Walker, it was the collapse of his last place of refuge. He didn't just lose a relationship, he lost the sense that he could still be a safe part of family life. That separation didn't come with screams or dramatic scenes, it was a heavy void, where each person walked away to preserve their own mental survival. When the marriage broke down, Walker faced a loneliness deeper than any previous phase. He had once been used to loneliness amid crowds, to living alone in fame, but this was the first time he was lonely because his own presence was a threat. That feeling ate at him day by day. He began to realize that the illness didn't just affect him, it stripped away his ability to be close to the people he loved most, and that realization turned the pain into heavy guilt. The truth, once it crossed the threshold of privacy, refused to stay quiet. The story of the broken marriage, the accusations of violence and threats, gradually emerged in public. The lights that once glorified Walker now shone directly into the darkest corners of his life. There was no longer a separation between the man and the icon, no place to hide behind titles or achievements. The public no longer saw him as a legend, they saw a man exposed in his most fragile state. And that exposure happened without mercy, without patience, without room for the complexity of the illness. For Walker, the most painful thing wasn't the criticism, it was seeing the things he feared most about himself now visible to others. He had once been terrified of not being able to trust himself, now he had to face the fact that others couldn't trust him either. Every newsline, every comment was a cut into an already shaky sense of dignity. He no longer had the ability to control the story of his life, and for someone who had lived by control for decades, that was almost a psychological annihilation. In that context, Walker lost the last refuge of his personal life. No family to return to, no private space to heal in silence. He stood naked before the public with a complex truth that few wanted to understand, that some people carry both moral responsibility and a disease that erodes their ability to self-regulate. But the world doesn't operate in those shades of gray. It demands simple answers, and Walker had none simple enough to soothe the thirst for judgment. The broken marriage didn't just end a relationship, it marked the collapse of the illusion that Walker still had a safe place to start over. He was forced to face the truth that his path to healing would have no familiar anchors, no family walls to shield him, no private space to stumble in quiet. Every next step happened under others' gaze while he was still learning to trust himself again. This was the phase when Herschel Walker didn't just lose a marriage, he lost the right to make mistakes in private. Private tragedy became public tragedy, and in that exposure, he had nowhere left to hide. All that remained was one man standing amid the ruins of his personal life, forced to decide: keep running from himself or face the truth, no matter how painful. After the marriage ended and every dark corner was laid bare to the public, Herschel Walker entered a pain even deeper, because it didn't come from the past or the illness, it came from the future he had once hoped to preserve: his role as a father. If the earlier parts were the story of a man fractured inside, this part is the story of a repeated generational wound. The child who grew up unheard now became the father rejected by his own child. openly, decisively, and without mercy. When Walker's son spoke out, it wasn't a private dispute, it was a confrontation before the entire society. The words were direct, unsoftened, leaving no room for sympathy. To the public, it was an accusation. To Walker, it was the heaviest sentence of his life. No more distance between illness and morality, between past trauma and present responsibility. Everything converged in one raw reality. His child did not feel safe, did not feel protected, and was not ready to forgive. No pain compares to losing your place as a father in your child's heart. Walker had already lost family, lost image, lost privacy, but here he lost something more fundamental, the right to be present as a father, not because he didn't want to love, but because that love wasn't enough to make up for the fear and hurt his child carried. And the cruelest part was that Walker couldn't deny it. He could explain the illness, the dissociation, the memory gaps, but no explanation could erase a child's sense of insecurity from growing up in fear. That rejection wasn't loud, but it was absolute. No half-open door, no promises of a future, just a clear boundary drawn, distance for self-protection. Walker faced what he had experienced as a child, but from the opposite position. Back then he was the child craving to be seen and heard. Now he was the father standing before the cold silence of his own child. The cycle of trauma repeated, not out of malice, but because unhealed cracks had passed to the next generation. What made this pain deeper was that Walker received no forgiveness. Forgiveness had once been his last hope to retain some meaning in his healing efforts. But when forgiveness didn't come, Walker was forced to face a hard truth. Some wounds can't be fully repaired, they can only be acknowledged and carried. He no longer had the right to demand empathy from the person he himself had harmed, and that acknowledgement, though necessary, also brought him to his knees in silence. The role of father, which Walker had hoped would break the past, now became the clearest mirror of what he hadn't yet healed. He realized that despite overcoming poverty, fame, injuries, and illness, he still couldn't overcome the consequences of those years of lost control. Fatherhood in this story wasn't redeemed by willpower or discipline. It hung suspended between desire and reality, between love and fear. Silence gradually became absolute. Walker didn't push back publicly, didn't argue, didn't try to reclaim his image, not because he wasn't hurting, but because he understood that any words now could deepen the wound. He chose to step back, accepting the role of someone standing outside his child's life, even though it tore him apart every day. Silence this time was no longer a child's survival mechanism. It was the moral choice of a father who understood his presence could cause harm. In that silence, Walker began to see his entire life journey more clearly, from the child no one listened to the man not allowed to be weak, to the father not accepted. Every stage connected by one painful thread, the rupture in human connection. He had once believed strength could make up for every deficit. Now he understood that some voids only strength makes more visible. This part of Walker's life had no climax, no resolution, no victory, only the bitter acceptance that some losses are permanent. He lost his role as father, not for lack of love, but because the love came too late, after fear had taken root, and in that loss, silence became the only form of existence left. Not silence to escape, but silence to avoid causing more harm. A heavy silence that closed the most painful chapter of the generational tragedy Herschel Walker carried for life. After losing his family, losing his role as father, and being pushed into absolute silence, Herschel Walker faced a choice few in his position dare to confront: speak the truth. Not the truth about achievements or glory, but the raw truth about mental illness, about the years he wasn't fully in charge of himself. It wasn't an act of self-salvation, it was a morally courageous act. Walker knew very well that when he opened his mouth, the price would not be small, but he also understood that if he stayed silent, he would betray himself once more. When Walker publicly revealed his dissociative identity disorder, he didn't do it with an attitude of begging for pity. He didn't justify, didn't blame, didn't evade responsibility. He simply said this was the truth he had lived with, struggled with, and was still trying to manage every day. But the world didn't receive that truth with understanding. The first reaction wasn't empathy, it was doubt. People questioned his motives. They questioned the timing. They wondered if this was an image strategy, an escape, or a clever performance. The doubt quickly slid into mockery. In media and on social networks, mental illness wasn't seen as a complex medical reality, but as a weakness to exploit. Walker's words were clipped, distorted, placed in sarcastic contexts. Some denied the diagnosis entirely. Some said he was overdoing it. Some even treated it as a joke. For Walker, this was another blow, not to his body or reputation, but to one of the rare efforts in his life to live honestly. He had braced for criticism, but he couldn't fully prepare for having his own truth denied. The most painful part was that Walker didn't receive full empathy, even from those who believed he was telling the truth. That empathy always came with conditions. Believe him, but keep distance. Believe him, but don't forgive. Believe him, but don't get involved. The truth, instead of bringing peace, placed him in a cold gray zone, exposed but not embraced. Walker began to realize a bitter reality. Society often encourages people to speak out, but isn't ready to stay when that truth is uncomfortable and complicated. For someone who had lived his entire life under pressure to be strong, publicly disclosing mental illness was an act that went against his every survival instinct. But the price of this courage brought no reward, no instant redemption, no moment of being embraced and told we understand. Instead came a subtler isolation. Walker was no longer attacked head-on, but he was also no longer seen as a whole person. He was framed as someone with issues, a new label replacing the old one of legend. And it was at this point that Walker's tragedy became clearer than ever. He had spoken the truth not to be loved again, but to stop lying. But the truth didn't heal broken relationships. It didn't bring his son back. It didn't erase fear from others' memories. It didn't make the public more compassionate. The truth did only one thing. It placed Walker in the position of having to live fully with himself, even if the price was loneliness. Yet what mattered was that Walker didn't take his words back. Even when doubted, mocked, misunderstood, he didn't return to the old silence. He didn't say he was wrong. He didn't apologize for speaking. That steadfastness wasn't loud or heroic, but it was a different kind of strength. The strength of standing in truth when there was nothing left to gain. Walker understood that if he retracted, he would return to the old cycle, hiding, enduring, self-punishing. And this time, he chose not to do that anymore. This part of Herschel Walker's life didn't carry the look of a victory. It had no climax, no dramatic shift in how the world treated him. But it marked an important turning point for the first time. Walker didn't let others' reactions decide the value of the truth. He accepted that honesty isn't always rewarded, but lying will certainly continue to destroy. In this new solitude, Walker no longer sought salvation from the outside. He held on to only one thing. He had told the truth, and he wouldn't turn back. That was the price of truth. And it was also the fragile but necessary foundation for whatever came next. After speaking the truth and accepting the cost, Herschel Walker stepped into a fork in the road where even he wasn't sure what he was looking for: politics. To many people, it was an incomprehensible move. To Walker, it was a final effort to reclaim a sense of worth in a world where he had lost nearly every anchor, not because he craved power, but because he craved meaning. When sports had closed, when family had shattered, when truth brought no peace, Walker needed a reason to believe his existence could still be useful to someone, to something bigger than himself. But politics isn't a land of healing. It's another arena, where old fame isn't respected, and past cracks aren't overlooked. Walker entered hoping that his life experience, his wounds, and his story of overcoming adversity could become a positive message. But he quickly realized that in politics, personal stories aren't heard with empathy, they're dissected with suspicion. Every word is weighed, every mistake magnified, every past dragged into unforgiving light. Controversy surrounded Walker almost immediately, statements scrutinized, contradictions exposed, decisions questioned. No more boundary between the man and the icon, no space for the complexity of someone with mental illness trying to live honestly. Walker was judged not as a person finding his way, but as an object to be defeated. That harshness made him realize politics doesn't allow fragility. It demands a solid self, an uncracked image, things Walker had lost long ago. The defeat, when it came, wasn't just an election result, it was the collapse of the hope that fame still held redemptive power. Walker had once believed that if he was famous enough, familiar enough, the world would be more patient. But here past fame didn't help him be heard, it only made him scrutinized more closely. What once gave power now became a burden. Every athletic achievement, every old title, no longer a foundation but a huge shadow that left him even more lost. That sense of being lost was deeper than any previous phase. In sports, Walker knew what to do: run faster, get stronger, endure more. In personal life, no matter how painful, he still understood where the pain came from. But in politics, Walker stood in an unfamiliar space where every rule was different, and every sincere effort could be interpreted as suspicious motive. He no longer knew what he was fighting for, or if he was being pulled into a battle that wasn't his. The most bitter part was Walker beginning to realize there was no role left that could save him from himself. Not the athlete role, not the father role, not the truth-teller role, and now not the politician role either. Each time he tried on a new identity, he discovered the problem wasn't in the role, it was in the unhealed wounds inside. Politics, instead of giving purpose, only reflected more clearly the emptiness he was trying to fill. After the controversies and the failure, Walker no longer had illusions that he could find worth through public recognition. He began to understand that fame in any field couldn't replace inner stability, and that realization, though painful, carried a necessary truth: he couldn't keep running from himself through new roles. Each failure wasn't just an external loss, it was a reminder that the path to healing doesn't lie on the public stage. This part of Herschel Walker's life didn't close with anger or bitterness, it closed with profound exhaustion. An exhaustion that no longer wanted to prove, no longer wanted to convince, no longer wanted to fight for recognition. Walker stood before the truth that his search for worth had gone through the noisiest paths, but still hadn't reached where he needed to go. And in that moment, when fame finally proved powerless, he was forced to face the hardest question: if there are no more lights, no more roles, who am I, and how can I keep living? That feeling of being lost didn't end the story, but it closed the final chapter of efforts to find worth from the outside. What remained ahead would no longer be a battle to be seen, it would be a quiet battle to exist with himself. After politics closed amid controversy and defeat, Herschel Walker's life moved into a different state, post-legend. No more stadium lights, no more microphones, no more clear roles to cling to. Everything became so quiet it was frightening. Mornings had no training schedule, no strategy, no measurable goals. Evenings had no noise to drown out thoughts. Walker woke up in a life where titles no longer meant anything, where he was no longer the athlete, no longer the candidate, no longer the icon, just one person facing his illness and his memories head-on. The days passed much longer than before, not because there was too much to do, but because nothing pushed him forward anymore. Walker had once lived by the brutal rhythm of training and competing, by the pressure to always advance. When all that vanished, the void appeared starkly. In that void were fragmented memories, disjointed pieces of life, moments he wasn't sure he had truly lived through or only heard about. Some days he felt relatively okay, some days old fears pulled him back without warning, without clear reason. Nights were the heaviest part. When all sounds settled, Walker's mind became an uncontrollable space. Uninvited thoughts appeared, old questions returned in new forms. What did I do? What did I miss? And what more can I do? The memory gaps didn't disappear just because the lights went out. They stayed there, like locked rooms in a house he had to keep living in. Walker no longer tried to throw every door open. He learned to walk slowly, to accept that some rooms should only be looked at from afar. Life at this point didn't look like redemption or salvation. It was management. Managing emotions, managing reactions, managing fear. Walker had to learn things he should have learned much earlier. Recognizing limits, asking for help, and stopping when needed. No one clapped when he managed it. No reward, only one goal: to survive without causing more harm to himself or others. For someone who once lived for victory, this was a radical, even painful change. Walker didn't call this state peace. Peace to him sounded like too big a promise. He called it being able to live, Some days being able to live was enough. Some days it was just not making things worse. He learned to accept that he wouldn't become his old self again, and he didn't need to. The after effects, physical and mental, were part of the present, not something to erase with willpower. Walker no longer punished himself for being weak. He also didn't praise himself for enduring. He just noted it. In the post-legend phase, Walker understood that fame once gave him purpose, but also took away his right to slow down. Now, with no one expecting him to be strong, he finally began to learn how to breathe at his own pace. It wasn't a beautiful journey, not inspiring in the familiar way. It was quiet, repetitive, and sometimes sad, but it was real. And for Walker, this truth, no matter how harsh, was still better than any role that had ever helped him hide. Life after the lights didn't bring big answers. It only brought the next days, and in each of those days, Herschel Walker learned to exist with the after effects, with the memories, with his incomplete self. He didn't call it peace, he just called it continuing. At the age of 63, Herschel Walker stepped into a climax without applause, without lights, without declarations. It was the climax of quiet acceptance. After everything he had been through, he had nothing left to prove. No need to prove he was strong. No need to prove he was right. No need to prove he was worthy. A life once measured by achievements, by victories, by admiration, eventually had to face the simplest and harshest question: how did I live? Walker looked back on his life not to boast, not to justify. He looked back like a man tired from constant fighting, from a childhood of poverty, where silence was the only way to survive, to the years when he turned his body into a tool, discipline into punishment, pain into the standard. He fought to be seen, to be accepted, to not be left behind. And even when he stood at the peak of fame, Walker never stopped fighting, against his body, against memories, against his own mind. At this stage of his life, Walker didn't ask to be understood. He knew that other people's understanding always has limits. No one could fully step into the gaps in his memory. No one could exactly feel the fear of not being able to trust himself. He also didn't ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness, if it came, was the right of those who had been hurt. Walker no longer waited for it as a condition to keep living. He understood that some wounds would never fully close, and demanding forgiveness only made them heavier. The only thing Walker did at the age of 63 was acknowledge that he had lived in a near constant state of fighting for almost his entire life. Not fighting for titles, but fighting to not collapse, fighting to hold on to control, fighting to not disappear. He realized that the strength the world once praised wasn't always real strength. It was just the strength of misunderstood endurance, placed on a pedestal and exploited until it was drained dry. Now, with no one demanding that he be strong, Walker began redefining strength in a different way. No longer the ability to take more pain, no longer the ability to get back up faster than others. Strength for him was the ability to stay when everything became raw, to stay with incomplete memories, to stay with an illness that didn't go away, to stay with broken relationships without trying to repaint them to make them look easier to accept. That was a kind of strength rarely celebrated, but more enduring than any run he ever made. Walker no longer tried to rewrite the story of his life. He didn't edit the past to make it more acceptable. He let it exist as it was: complex, contradictory, and full of loss. At the age of 63, he understood that peace doesn't come from everyone acknowledging he was right. It comes from no longer having to lie to himself. He had spoken the truth, paid the price, and now he didn't need to keep arguing with the world about it. There were days when Walker still felt empty. There were days when memories came back without warning. There were nights when sleep arrived late and left early. But unlike before, he didn't see those things as failure. He saw them as part of continuing to live after a lifetime that had been too long in battle. Each passing day was no longer a test. It was a slow, conscious step forward, even if uncertain. The climax of this story wasn't a moment of glory. It was the moment Walker stopped running, stopped looking for new roles, stopped hoping fame would save him, stopped believing he had to be understood to have the right to exist. At the age of 63, he stood in a quiet space where there was nothing left to prove, and for the first time, that didn't terrify him. Strength in the end was redefined by Walker not through victory, but through the ability to keep enduring without denying his fragility, not enduring to become greater, but enduring to cause no more harm, not enduring to be admired, but enduring to live truthfully. And in that quietness, Herschel Walker didn't find complete peace, but he found something else, more humble, harder to see, an acceptance sufficient to keep existing without having to fight himself every day. Herschel Walker's journey closed not with a victory, nor with complete redemption, but with an American-style tragedy, quiet, heavy, and real to the point of being impossible to deny. This wasn't the story of a perfect legend. On the contrary, it was the story of a man crushed between the ideals society built up, and then forced him to live fully within. Walker didn't fall because he lacked strength, he fell because he was required to always be strong, every moment, everywhere, without exception. America loves tireless heroes, loves bodies that endure violence without complaint, loves men who swallow pain inward, and keep moving forward, as if pain were proof of worth. Walker was placed in that mold from a very young age, from the poor stuttering boy in Georgia, to the icon of strength in college sports, to the warrior in the NFL. Everything reinforced one single message: men are not allowed to be weak. And Walker believed that message with his entire life. The tragedy lies in the fact that this ideal of masculinity didn't just demand physical strength, it completely denied inner life. No one asked Walker if he was okay, because strong people don't need to be asked. No one taught him how to grieve, because heroes aren't allowed to grieve. No one gave him language to name fear, because fear was seen as failure. In that world, Walker didn't just run, didn't just collide, he erased himself to fit the image society wanted. When the mental after effects appeared, they weren't seen as consequences of prolonged violence and inhuman pressure, they were seen as personal faults. When he spoke the truth, he wasn't embraced, he was doubted. When his family broke apart, people looked for blame, not causes. When he sought new meaning, he was judged without mercy. The American-style tragedy isn't a man failing, it's a system that only knows how to celebrate while useful, then turns its back when no longer fitting the victory narrative. Walker wasn't an irresponsible victim. He didn't evade what he had caused, but he also wasn't the simple monster many wanted to believe. He was the product of a culture that turned endurance into virtue, silence into masculinity, and violence into entertainment. In that culture, Walker did exactly what he was taught: grit his teeth, endure, don't cry for help, don't stop. And the price was an entire inner life broken. Herschel Walker's legacy doesn't lie in stats or titles. Even though they were once brilliant, his legacy is the painful truth about strength. That strength isn't never falling, it's the price paid when falling is forbidden. That a society that only celebrates physical strength, while scorning mental fragility, will sooner or later create tragedies like Walker's. And that if we keep teaching children that emotions are weakness, we are planting seeds for unnamed wounds. This story's ending has no cheap call for hope, no miraculous healing, only a man who lived his whole life in battle, finally stopping and acknowledging his truth. That acknowledgement didn't erase the consequences, but it placed a necessary period on a false legend. Walker didn't ask to be understood, he didn't ask to be forgiven. He only left a bitter reminder: when society demands men become icons, society must also bear responsibility for what happens when the icon shatters. In silence, Herschel Walker's story stands like a hard-to-look-at mirror. It isn't meant to make us admire, it forces us to think about how we define strength, about how we treat those who gave their bodies, youth, and minds to meet an ideal, and about the price America has paid, is paying, and will continue to pay if tragedies like this are still seen as normal. The story of Herschel Walker leaves a very particular kind of sadness, not because he lacked glory, but because the price he paid for that glory was too great and lasted his whole life. Behind the image of the invincible running hero was a man who grew up in poverty in Georgia, with a stutter, who learned to be silent to survive, then turned discipline into punishment to cover shame. When Walker was worshipped by the nation, from the national championship, the Heisman Trophy, to the NFL, that worship didn't bring mental protection, It placed an inhumane expectation on his shoulders. Don't be weak, don't stop, don't be wrong. The physical injuries piled up in his professional career, the memory gaps, the uncontrolled outbursts, and finally the diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder revealed a painful truth. The strength society praised had hidden a mind broken very early. The tragedy grew heavier when the consequences spread to his family. A marriage broken in fear, a son publicly confronting and rejecting him, leaving Walker without the role of father, the one he once hoped would redeem his past. Even when he bravely spoke about his mental illness, that truth brought no peace, only doubt, mockery and judgment. At the age of 63, with nothing left to prove, Walker didn't ask to be understood, didn't ask to be forgiven. He simply acknowledged he had lived his whole life in constant battle. The lesson for Americans from this story is a profound warning. A society that glorifies masculinity based on endurance and silence is creating silent tragedies of its own. Real strength isn't never falling, it's being allowed to be weak, to get help, and to heal before it's too late. Herschel Walker's story isn't just pitiable, it's worthy of respect, because it forces us to redefine strength, responsibility, and humanity in our own culture. If the story of Herschel Walker made you pause to think about strength, trauma, and the price of silence, subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the fates behind the spotlight together. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next video, where we keep listening to the real stories history rarely tells in full.